He has ranted and raved, and just like that, he gave the game away. Even Putin admits it. It's over for Russia. Something big is breaking in the country right now as the brutal statistics show us that Russia isn't going to recover for 100 years. The Russian economy is down the toilet. The levels of cope on display are pathetic. And the worst of it is, not even the end of the Ukraine war is going to be enough to save Russia from the financial abyss into which its leader has led the country. Vladimir Putin has just revealed what the Kremlin has been trying to hide for years. And he did it in the most Putin way possible, by pointing out a problem and then acting as though he had nothing to do with it. Statistics show that economic growth has, unfortunately, been declining for 2 months in a row. Overall, GDP contracted by 1.8% between January and February, Putin announced during a meeting on economic issues per Interfax. Russia's president added, manufacturing and industrial production in general, as well as such a systemically important sector as construction, suffered losses. Finally, Putin has acknowledged the impact that the war he started is having on his country. Granted, he only acknowledged the first 2 months of 2026. Putin was oddly quiet about the fact that Russia's GDP, or gross domestic product, grew only 1% in 2025 after 2 years of growth that exceeded 4%, and in 2024's case came close to 5%. But baby steps are still steps, even if Putin is making admissions via omission. After all, GDP contraction is the result of the war economy that Putin created, and we're going to be explaining all of the effects that particular Putin decision is having on Russia in a few minutes. First, the headline stats. The 1.8% contraction that Putin mentions for January and February means that Russian GDP was 1.8% lower than it had been during the same months in 2025. Keep what we just told you about the slow GDP growth of that year in mind, and you'll realize that this is far more damaging to Russia than it might appear at first glance. Russia's GDP is actively declining and isn't going to get much better. Ukraine today reports that Russia's central bank has forecast GDP growth of 1.6% for the first quarter. Hey, that's progress, right? Maybe not, as the Russian Academy of Sciences says that the first quarter of 2026 will actually see a year-on-year decline of 1.5%. Somebody is trying to massage the figures. Now, why on earth would Russia's central bank have a vested interest in appeasing Putin by claiming that growth is on the way? We'll leave you to ponder that question. Returning to Putin's comments, did he come up with some master plan for fixing the freefall in Russia's GDP? Of course not. Russia's president didn't even acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, the economic situation inside Russia is what it is because he launched an invasion of Ukraine that has lasted for over 4 years and continuing. I expect to hear detailed reports today on the current economic situation and why the trajectory of macroeconomic indicators is currently below expectations. Moreover, below the expectations of not only experts and analysts, but also the government's own forecasts and those of the Central Bank of Russia, Putin declared during the meeting. One can only wonder what these reports are going to say. It would take a very brave Russian economist, or perhaps a Swiftie who can't resist the urge to say, "You're the problem, Putin, it's you." Putin may be conveniently acting like he has nothing to do with Russia's situation, but he has also decided that now is the time to act as though there are good things about Russia's economy. The cope got very real during the meeting, as Putin declared that experts around him have pointed to the calendar as one of the reasons why Russia's economy contracted so heavily during the first couple of months of 2025. In January of this year, there were 2 fewer working days than last year, and in February, there was 1 fewer working day, Putin said. He's not wrong, but really, Putin. Losing 3 working days is enough to cause 1.8% GDP contraction. If that's the case, why are other countries growing? The UK, which is hardly in a stellar economic position itself, recorded a 0.1% real GDP growth in January and 0.5% growth in February. Not great figures, but given that Japan, the US, and the group of 7 nations as a whole are recording growth in the 0.1 to 0.3% range, it aligns with what we're seeing elsewhere in the world. Yet Russia's economy contracted by 1.8%. Is Putin trying to claim that other nations magically had the 3 extra working days that Russia missed out on? Blaming the calendar feels like a weak excuse, and it certainly isn't enough to explain the numbers that are coming out of Russia right now. Putin also pointed to Russia's low unemployment rate as another bright spot. Currently, unemployment stands at 2.1%. This, among other things, indicates that our labor market is changing and flexible. Platform-based forms of employment are developing, Putin said during his meeting. A 2.1% unemployment rate is certainly impressive, at least on the surface. But there are a few problems with Putin's numbers that show not even that low figure is really the highlight that Putin claims it to be. For one, we don't know how accurate that figure is. In a January 10th piece, Eurasia Review reported on claims made by economist Valentin Katasanov, who said that the 2.1% figure, or 2.2% as it was in January, doesn't come close to capturing the full scale of Russian unemployment. The percentage fails to include anybody who hasn't registered themselves as unemployed with the authorities. It also doesn't account for those who are supposed to be employed but don't have real full-time work because their days are being cut or their companies are putting them in a standstill due to not having enough work for them. Katasanov says that Russia's unemployment rate likely doubles if these issues are taken into account, so the rosy picture that Putin is trying to paint in that department isn't what it seems. What else is new for Russia's leader? But let's say that we take Putin's 2.1% unemployment rate figure at face value. Even if it's true, this is another case of Putin telling on himself. What Putin is trying to frame as a good thing for Russia's economy is actually a sign that the country has a labor crisis. Remember, Russia is a country that Ukraine claims has suffered over 1.3 million casualties since Putin launched his invasion. That's a lot of people, mainly men, who have simply disappeared from Russia's workforce. And as the American Foreign Policy Council notes, Russia entered Putin's war facing severe demographic and labor crises. For Russia, the most optimistic scenario for solving these problems is to bring in 550,000 migrants each year just to stop its population from shrinking, and that's before taking the war debt into account. Signs of a labor shortage problem were already starting to become clear in 2024. The council says that's the year when the Russian job site Superjob reported that 73% of the companies in the country were understaffed. Fast forward to April 16th, and the Moscow Times reports that the governor of Russia's central bank, Elvira Nabiullina, is warning that Russian businesses are being forced into raising wages to compete for staff in a job market that simply isn't providing enough options. Those higher wages are increasing production costs for these businesses, which is creating price shocks for consumers. A lack of workers in Russia is now the primary threat to price stability in the country. So maybe a 2.1% unemployment rate isn't as good as Putin claims it to be. What it really seems to signify is that Putin has found no solution for a labor shortage problem that has existed for years. If anything, he's made the problem worse by waging a war that will have cost Russia millions of potential workers by the time it's all over. That's the good stuff about Russia's economy out of the way, and it certainly isn't looking like any of it is particularly positive, despite Putin's spin. But here's where it gets serious. Russia's real problem is that several sectors of its economy are in active free fall as we speak, and there isn't much Putin can do about it. But before we get into that, this is a quick reminder that you are watching The Military Show. If you're getting valuable insight from this video, subscribe to the channel so you never miss our analysis. There are serious economic problems inside Russia. We know that you've heard that before, likely on this very channel. But what we're seeing now is the cascading effects of 4 years of terrible decisions made by Putin that are sending Russia into a financial abyss out of which it won't be able to climb. We'll start with business activity. According to Ukraine Today, which shares information from the Moscow Times, the Russian central bank's enterprise monitoring has revealed that business activity growth is on the decline in Russia. Using its Business Climate Indicator, or BCI, for which any number above 0 is a sign of growth and any number below is a sign of decline, Russia went from a BCI of 0.2 in January to minus 0.1 in February. At the very best, we could call it stagnant, and it only gets worse from there. The central bank has also recorded a sharp decline in business revenues across most of Russia's industries for the first quarter of 2026, and that decline has been getting worse with each passing month of the year. The New Voice of Ukraine has more statistics that highlight the scale of Russia's industry-related problems. Construction, which has long been a linchpin of Russia's domestic economy, saw output fall 16% year-on-year in January. February saw a further decline of 14%, which is likely the result of investment in fixed capital having fallen by 5.3% during the fourth quarter of 2025. Manufacturing output in Russia fell by 2.9% year-on-year during the first 2 months of 2026. Russia's cargo turnover of commercial transport dropped off a cliff in February, falling to 430.3 billion ton-kilometers, which is the lowest that it's been since 2020, which was the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. Retail trade in Russia is stagnant too, and wage growth is starting to slow down. It was at 8% in February, compared to 13.5% for the whole of 2025. What all of this tells us is that Russia's businesses are struggling. Already dealing with a massive labor shortage, they're now losing money hand over fist, which means they can't even offer the higher wages they could in the past. We're starting to see desperate measures being put into place to account for all of this. Several factories in Russia are moving to 3-day work weeks, United 24 Media reported on March 30th. Among them is IZ Cartex, which is a mining excavator plant that has already put 38% of its staff on reduced hours. In Leningrad alone, the outlet says, 8 enterprises have had to stop production altogether, with another 16 cutting their schedules. The Russian auto sector is also dealing with these sorts of problems. Avtovaz and Kamaz, which are Russia's 2 largest vehicle manufacturers, have had to halt production and cut working hours respectively. KAMAZ has gone down to a 4-day work week, mirroring a move it pulled in the summer of 2025 as sales of Russian vehicles collapse. Back in November, the Russian tank manufacturer Uralvagonzavod announced mass layoffs that saw the number of employees in some of its units decline by 50%. These aren't the kinds of moves that healthy businesses make. They're moves that businesses start making when they aren't receiving the orders that they need to stay solvent as they head towards inevitable collapse. And on an even wider level, these business issues are having an impact on Russia's federal budget. Russia has been taxing its non-oil and gas companies into oblivion. Value-added tax has been increased, as have excise tax and several other taxes. Despite all of this, Russia only managed to pull in about 7% more revenue from its non-energy-related businesses during the first quarter of 2026. And this was as expenditures for the Russian federal budget jumped up by 17%. The result? A 4.58 trillion ruble or $60 billion budget deficit at a time when Russia is spending hundreds of billions of dollars on fighting the war in Ukraine. We just mentioned oil and gas. Energy is the cornerstone of Russia's economy. The Oxford Institute for Energy Studies says that taxation on revenue created by Russia's oil and gas companies typically makes up between 30 and 50% of federal budget revenues, with the energy industry as a whole accounting for 20% of Russia's GDP. The conclusion we can draw from these percentages is that a strong energy sector typically means good economic conditions inside Russia, but a weak energy sector, now that's a problem. And it's another problem that's being reported by Russia itself. In an April 8th press release, Russia's Ministry of Finance reported that federal budget revenues for the first quarter of 2026 were 8.2% lower than they were during the same period in 2025. The 7.1% increase generated from taxing non-energy businesses ended up being nowhere near enough to make up for the shortfall in oil and gas money, the revenues derived from which were 45.4% lower than they were in 2025. Lower oil prices were blamed for this shortfall, and the loss of money from energy has also led to Russia suspending gold and foreign currency transactions until July 1st. Not even the results of Operation Epic Fury are helping Russia as much as they should be. When the US began its operation against Iran, the Iranian regime blockaded the Strait of Hormuz. The US has since blockaded Iranian ports and is working on trying to get traffic flowing through the vital waterway. The problem this has caused relates to the fact that about 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas flow through the Strait of Hormuz every year. Blockades mean no oil and gas flow, and that has resulted in price shocks all over the world. Oil prices have been hovering around the $100 per barrel mark for much of Operation Epic Fury, and Russia has been able to take advantage of that fact. Even selling at a discount, Russia has been able to get more for each barrel that its shadow fleet transports because there is less oil coming out of the Gulf region. On April 9th, Reuters reported that Russia will see revenue from its main oil tax double to $9 billion in April, all due to the situation in the Middle East. That's a bright spot for Russia, but it also won't last. If the US and Iran can come to any sort of agreement that leads to the reopening of Hormuz, oil prices will drop, and Russia will be right back into a situation where sanctions and Ukrainian attacks on its oil facilities cause oil and gas revenues to decline. As all of these economic problems mount up, the best that Russia can hope for is short-term boosts caused by situations that are outside of its direct control. As soon as those situations are resolved, Russia is right back into a problem zone. CMASF, which is a Russian think tank, notes that the oil situation right now is basically a band-aid placed over a gaping wound. Even as it raised its forecast for the export price of Urals crude to $81.6 per barrel, it says that this would only accelerate Russia's economic growth for 2026 by 0.5%, and that growth wouldn't exceed 1.3% in total. And that's an optimistic scenario for Russia, given that all the signs right now are pointing to 2026 being a year when Russia enters a recession. Putin is calling for solutions. That isn't much good when it's Putin himself who lies at the root of all this. Interest rates inside Russia remain high, and the central bank says it isn't going to be lowering them to any significant degree anytime soon. Investment into Russia's businesses fell by 2.3% in 2025, and Russia's Ministry of Economic Development believes another decline is coming in 2026. Plus, the only investments that are being made into Russia's companies are coming from those companies themselves. Now, what do you think happens when those businesses aren't making profits? They invest less, which means they don't grow, resulting in yet more struggles for the Russian economy. There is no offset coming for Russia, no acceleration that will lead to economic recovery. All that Putin has created is a mountain of issues that has put Russia into a death spiral. And the only way for Russia to stand any chance at all of escaping that spiral is to do the one thing that Putin will never do: end the Ukraine war. But not even that is likely to save Russia at this point. In an opinion piece for the Moscow Times, Vasily Burov, who is the director of the Estonto Lab consulting firm, and Andrei Yakovlev, who is an associate researcher at Harvard University's Davis Center, note that Russia's economic problems started long before Putin launched his invasion. Russia chose guns over butter long before 2022, the duo writes, as it notes that Putin has spent years concentrating Russia's power and resources among regional elites, Kremlin cronies, and big businesses. That means that there wasn't much left for the little guys to scrap over even before the Ukraine war was started, and there is even less now. Russia has chronically underinvested in social services and infrastructure. There is a war inside Russia itself as the centralization of Russia's wealth leads to poverty in regions outside of Moscow, which Burov and Yakovlev say is a purposeful decision now because it gives Putin a wellspring of recruits for his army. But the reality is that the disparities that have been thrown into a harsh spotlight since Putin invaded Ukraine have existed and accumulated for years. They won't go away because the war ends. This is Putin's entire system. Concentrate all wealth at the top and leave the rest of Russia to burn. Any trust that entrepreneurs might have had in the Russian state disappeared long ago. If anything, the end of the Ukraine war would only solidify the status quo that Putin has created. A tyrannical madman concerned only with enriching himself as his country burns is not the man to look for solutions to the economic problems that he's caused. There is no hope left for Russia, just a cascading drop into an ever-worsening economic situation. Even if the Ukraine war ends, all of the problems we've highlighted will remain. And as long as Putin and his buddies are getting richer, they'll have no incentive to make anything better for the rest of the country. So what is the ultimate solution that Putin has called on the country's economists to come up with? They'll never tell him, but it's getting rid of Putin himself. That won't happen, and it means that Russia won't even be able to show signs of recovery until Putin dies. There's plenty of panic inside the Kremlin about all of this, and there's also plenty of panic about how badly Russia is failing on the front lines in Ukraine. As Putin retreats deeper into delusional isolation, Ukraine's strategy is exposing vulnerabilities in Russia's military that are causing some inside the Kremlin to ring alarm bells. Find out more about that in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure that you subscribe to the Military Show to keep up with our coverage of Putin's war and the impact that it's having on Russia. And thank you, as always, for watching.